Hey, hello everybody. Welcome to the Basu and Godin Notebook, January 29th edition. We're Monday morning. You look all snappy and I'm not used to seeing you like this outside.
Yeah, I got places to be. I got to look good sometimes. Usually I look like a bum, but not today. Today.
That's good. Yes. It's a welcome change.
Yeah.
So Canadiens are hitting their bye week. They're going to be off for the next little while, and it's time maybe to hit pause. Maybe we're going to continue our podcast, but it's a good time to take a step back and reflect on certain things. And I think that the game on Saturday in Pittsburgh gave us an interesting appreciation of what the Canadiens can hope for in the future when it comes to some of their best young players, and namely Slavkovsky and Guhly and Slavkovsky, who once again stood out. Slavkovsky seems to be really has hit his stride and doesn't seem to be slowing down after really changing gears maybe around early December. And Guhly, especially since he's been split from Barron, and seems to have rekindled his groove from earlier in the season, and is playing some really solid hockey right now.
Yeah, I mean, especially considering not only Saturday night, but really since the move to the right was predicated by facing Connor McDavid, facing Nathan MacKinnon, that sort of that stretch where I think Marty looked at Guhly and Matheson as being kind of his two best skating defensemen. So let's get them on the ice against McDavid, against MacKinnon, against these top players. And has been up to the challenge every time. Yeah. And Saturday night was no different. He got a steady dose, I think 13 minutes at 5-on-5 against Sidney Crosby. Held his own. Not like the Canadiens didn't dominate or anything, but they weren't dominated in those minutes. So, aside from the one otherworldly generational play that Sidney Crosby made to tie the game with that spinorama backhand no-look blind pass to Jake Guentzel on the tape. Guentzel talking about it. Well, Guentzel talking about it afterwards was it literally hit my tape. I couldn't miss that. I didn't have to do anything. So Guhly and Slavkovsky was obviously checking Crosby at that time, and I don't think anyone, even the most seasoned defenseman, would not be able to anticipate that play happening the way it did. And so, other than that, I had an excellent game against him, and is showing time and time again that he is already, but definitely going to be, sort of a premier shutdown type defenseman. So that's encouraging. I thought Matheson had a really good game on Saturday too, against his former team. But
always a motivation.
It's one thing to get traded away from a team where you've been struggling, but Penguins trading him for Jeff Petrie, I think probably Matheson would never admit it, but you got to think that's a little different. Where you're like, oh yeah, you thought that was an upgrade, guys? Look at this. So
yeah,
but yeah, as far as Guhly is concerned, and he's just, I think the common link between these two guys, Guhly and Slavkovsky, is just the demeanor and the quiet. Well, I think in one case, quiet confidence, which would be Guhly, and in the other case, a little bit louder confidence, which is Slavkovsky. But it's kind of it's good to see in both cases that, when they're faced with a challenge, they step up to it. Guhly, and I think this has been the case with Guhly ever since he moved to the right. Remember, he's playing on the right. It's not easy to do. And so it's just it's another encouraging sign that they have, kind of two, if not superstar pieces, but really exceptional pieces to what could one day be a winning team.
It's really credit to Trevor Timmons on that one regarding Guhly, because he was drafted 16th overall, and I remember when he was drafted, Timmins said, this was our guy. The only other guy that he was sort of crossing his fingers so that he would still be available, it was unlikely to be, was Seth Jarvis. But you look at the other guys that were drafted before, all good players, but I mean, Dylan Holloway really has not found his niche yet in the NHL on a regular basis. Well, Rodion Amirov, rest in peace. Anton Lundell is turning into a very nice, two-way
a difficult season though. Kind of surprisingly, he's sort of
offensively maybe, but I mean he's got acute defensive skills for a player. He's got
Absolutely.
A good 200-foot game. Askarov, we brought it up on an earlier episode. I still feel a bit puzzled that he seems to be the odd man out, and they want to keep Saros in Nashville. That's a red flag for me. Perfetti's been injured often. Quinn's been injured often. So, you look at all those guys, it's a good draft. Don't get me wrong, but at 16, I don't think the Canadiens could have hoped for a better outcome. And you look at all the players that were drafted after, even Dawson Mercer, even Braden Schneider, all those guys, I'd rather have Guhle because he's so steady.
I think Mercer was the one that everyone was, especially since he played in the queue. Like, I think he was the one that drew the most sort of like, why not take him kind of thing, especially because this notion that the Canadiens need high-end offensive talent existed then as it exists now. So I think Mercer was the one, and I think even to some extent Reichel, and then obviously there was Hendrix Lapierre, who was the Quebec kid that people were mentioning, maybe you should take him, and obviously that is not the case. They should not have taken him instead of Guhle, but Mercer, there's an argument to be made.
Yeah.
I mean, he's played over 200 games already. He's got 120 points in the NHL. So, but yeah, I would agree that Guhle is because the way you got to look at these things is what is the scarcity of this player? A player who is as defensively sound, as physical, who is as mobile, as Caden Guhle, who can play big minutes against top opposition and not hurt you at all, and in fact allow you to at worst break even against some of the top players in the league, is valuable, especially in the playoffs. When you have a guy who can do that. And nothing against Dawson Mercer. I think he's a wonderful player, and he's talented and is a good, even a very good NHL forward, or will be in the coming years. I just don't think he's as scarce of a commodity year to year to year as someone like Guhle is at that point in the draft, like picking in the middle of the first round. Like that's, I think usually you get guys like Guhle in the top 10, generally speaking. And so yeah, I would agree that, there's nothing there either before or particularly after, especially with the way Lucas Reichel is struggling this season in Chicago. That suggests that they should have done anything differently. And Guhle's showing it every night.
I remember we had a discussion at the Bell Center earlier, last week, and he mentioned to you how he has dreams of Team Canada. Guhle pictures himself like as a national team level type of defenseman. I think it says a lot about how he pictures himself and the standards that he expects of himself. He's got a profile of being a Team Canada type of guy, eventually, because he's not all just offense, but he's such a well-rounded defenseman. I think that
a lot of substance.
A lot.
Over flash. And just on the Team Canada thing, I think it's worth pointing out, like I was talking about him playing on the right side, and it's not like he's thrilled about it. Like he's not upset about it, but it's not like something that he's overjoyed with, like it's he mentioned, he's like, it's not as if I come walk in the room and if I see my name on the right side, I'm all pissed off, but it kind of is what it is, and he's willing to do whatever. Like he wasn't very enthusiastic about it, but he himself brought up, it's just another thing to add to my toolbox in case, like I didn't ask him about Team Canada. That didn't come from me. That came from him. It's important kind of context to it. And I remember the next day, Brian Mudrick, who does the games at TSN, came up to me. He's like, "Did Guhle just mention Team Canada on his own, or did you ask him about it?" I was like, "No, no. You did that all by. There's a reason that quote is in there. Is he brought it up all on his own." So yeah, I agree that that's sort of his mindset. And so the parallel here, when talking about Slaf, is the other night against the Islanders. I went up to him and asked him about the Patrick Watt thing and how he felt watching it and everything. And he's like, "Oh, it's really great. It's really great to see how they don't forget the great players here." And then he like stopped and he smiled and he even laughed. And he's like, "Hopefully I'm one of those guys one day." So like in a similar vein,
Yeah.
he's able to say comfortably that I aspire to things like that, just like Guhle aspires to things like playing for Team Canada.
But the funny thing, though, is that when it comes, if we choose to extrapolate and look at the candidates for an eventual, World Cup, Four Nation tournament, or even Olympics down the road, Team Canada has got more right-handed defensemen. Some of them are aging, like the Drew Doughties and the Alex Pietrangelos, but I mean, they still got the right-handed shots. They got Cale McCarr that's there, Noah Dobson, Evan Bouchard is coming out. Is really, is having sort of a breakout year. Whereas on the left, it's really not the same.
Devin Taves, and there's like I think the Taves McCarr combo will be a package deal for Team Canada for a while, but otherwise, yeah, it's.
I mean, you got Josh Morrissey. That in my books would be a lock. But apart from that, how many more, really offensive, high point producing guys do you want in your back end? You cannot have 6 guys like that. So if you want to consider defense among your defense group, well, Morgan Rielly, if you have to choose between Morgan Rielly and some, really offensive-minded defensemen that would be right-handed shot, maybe they'd say, well, our guys on the left, maybe if they could defend well, that'd be helpful. And that's where I think the Guhle
bring a physical element too, and be able to skate on a bigger ice surface, which Guhle could do. But it's listen, he's got a long way to go to get there, but his ability to play these shutdown minutes effectively, and the fact that he himself, and Guhle's always played for Team Canada. It's not as if he's, he has a history of playing for Team Canada. It's a history of being, he was the number 1 pick in the WHL. Like, it's not as if he's not accustomed to high level competition, but that's where he sees himself. That's for sure notable. And that's, and that to me comes back to the notion of responding to pressure. Guhle going up against McDavid, McKinnon, now Crosby, coming out okay on each of those occasions. Slaf the other night on Saturday gets a shift in overtime. Matheson gives him the puck in his own end. Suddenly he's the last guy back, and Sidney Crosby is coming in on him to pressure him. And does he panic and just get rid of the puck? No. He doubles back around, sheds Crosby, weaves his way into the offensive zone, finds himself one-on-one with Chris Letang, for crying out loud, goes inside-outside on him, creates a chance on goal, and almost wins the game. So,
shot just missed by that much. Yeah.
It was a good save, and he had a good shot. And so that, to me, that is a level of cool under pressure. Like, his instincts just took over, and he didn't care that it was Sidney Crosby pressuring him. He didn't care that it was Chris Letang he's coming in on. He, just as a 19-year-old kid, was like, you know what, I'm just going to go and try this. And it almost worked. And so, again, that's just a mindset that he's demonstrated. And we mention it all the time, but I think it's worth repeating sometimes, is that, the Canadiens got a lot of flack for putting too much focus on his international resume on his draft year and not putting enough focus on the larger sample of games he played in Finland. A big reason they did that is that aside from his size and his skill and everything else, the one thing they really liked about Slavkovsky as it relates to playing in Montreal was his ability to handle pressure situations. The fact that in Slovakia, he's been seen as the next one for years, even though the rest of us didn't know it, but he's been looked upon as the next best player out of Slovakia since he was like 14 years old. So on the international stage, he's done things at an age that no one's ever done before, and has performed consistently well. and that speaks to an ability to not wither in a high pressure environment. And even this season, I think the way he came out of that prolonged slump in, say, late November, when that trip through Vegas, Arizona, like Vegas, he didn't have a single shot attempt in the game. Arizona didn't look any better, and the noise was getting quite loud of him going to the AHL and how he's from across the league, not just the Montreal market, but I mean there was people like from all over the NHL, people with large platforms. I don't know, Ryan Whitney was sort of like this guy's being. He's lost in the NHL. You're ruining this guy, and frankly, the way he was playing, it wasn't a bad take. It didn't look very good.
No. We brought it up back then. I mean, there was a point where it was legitimate. Yeah.
But for him to come out of that situation the way he has, I think Marty St. Louis deserves credit for that, because I think even within the Canadiens, front office, there was some questions as to whether we're doing the right thing here. And I think Marty kind of insisted on keeping him. And that's why he put him with Suzuki and Caulfield in St. Louis on that trip. He didn't stay there, but you're seeing now the work that's got into him and how he has been able to absorb that work. I think that's one thing that bears repeating is how, just like Guhly, just like we mentioned with Guhly, like his desire to be great is quite high, and he's willing to understand the work that goes into it and the adjustments that he needs to make to his game. And the one thing I think is worth watching with Slavkovsky that I find really interesting, look at him go into a 50-50 situation along the boards now. Oftentimes he backs into it. I really feel, I haven't been able to ask Marty about this, but this seems like something like Marty told him to do. Like, it's just like he backs into it, uses his body to shield the puck, and then just gets possession of the puck. And it's really an odd way to go into a puck battle situation. Most players don't back into them.
Yeah.
But I've noticed him doing that quite often recently, and it's really effective. And so the more of these little tricks he learns on how to use his physical advantage, the better he's going to become. But I mean, that game on Saturday, it bears mentioning, like, he gets taken off the Suzuki Caulfield line and moved on to the Monahan Armia line, and Monahan Armia were playing really well, but all of a sudden that's the Canadiens' best line.
Yeah.
And the Suzuki line is no longer the Canadiens' best line. I don't know. I don't think it's a coincidence.
No, it's very, I find it very significant, because at some point earlier on when Slavkovsky was brought up to playing with Suzuki and Caulfield, it was seen as a promotion, and everybody was wondering, well, will he be able to hold his own? And now he's, without saying that he was the one who made that line work, he was certainly helping making it better. And the fact that he has not missed a beat, not being on that line anymore, shows how he's not necessarily dependent on other players to grow and improve. It's an individual path that he's on, and that also that self-insurance. It might be just a detail in the game, but you mentioned how he's got a certain assertiveness and going into battles and developing his ways. But another sign for me of things of showing that he's comfortable on the ice right now is how feisty he's getting. Also, I remember in the press box the other night, I told you, I said one day he'll want to learn how to drop the gloves, because he feels like someone who'll be more than happy to take part into scrums and to assert his physical dominance. He's really competitive in that aspect. He seems to enjoy it. It's always fury and pleasure seems to really intertwine.
Well, we saw him shit talking the Islanders bench on the way off the ice on Thursday.
Exactly. Yeah. So that, I mean, that's an after the whistle type of thing. So it's minor, but also it's part of a mindset. I find that really shows how, okay, I'm not just the new kid on the block anymore. I'm a man. I belong, and I'm going to do things my way as much as possible.
And that's something he always repeats. He said it Saturday night how I think it was Renaud Lavoie that asked him, do you want to be a difference maker one day in this league? Which obviously he does, but he always says, "I want to be the man." That's his preferred line when talking about his ambitions.
Yeah.
Guhly talks about Team Canada. For him, I want to be the man. Is what he always says. He's consistent in that regard. Like that's his thing. Like I want to be the man for my team. And so let's see. I mean, it's important not to get carried away. It's not as if Slavkovsky is lighting the world on fire, producing a whole bunch of points, scoring goals at will. Like it's not that.
No.
But it's clear he's such a perfect example of a kid that you need to watch play as opposed to looking at numbers, even though his underlying numbers are excellent. When you watch him play, you see the difference he makes. You see how much possession time he extends in the offensive zone, puck retrievals, going to the net, making, and even though I think he could stand to shoot a bit more, but still, like his ability to pass the puck continues to stand out. The Suzuki goal against the Islanders, a perfect example where no one would have faulted him for shooting that puck from where he was with the look he had, and still made a play to Suzuki to open the scoring for the Canadiens. It's just his brain, the level of comfort and composure in his brain at 19 is pretty impressive, and really, again, just like Guhly, bodes well for the future for the Canadiens. What his ceiling is, I don't know, but his floor is going up with each passing game.
So, yeah, it's a nice reminder that most 19-year-olds are not in the NHL. They're not there yet. So when you see him play now, you see, he might have thought that things were happening fast for him before, and because of that, he had sort of a tunnel vision. But that doesn't mean that he's a tunnel vision player. I think that as he gets more and more comfortable, his vision widens, and it's going to express itself more and more. It's not. It's like it's a different type of player. But I remember we used to say that about Max Pacioretty, how he used to really work in a tunnel when you first arrived in the NHL, and at some point really broaden his vision to a certain extent. He's not necessarily the finest playmaker, and he remains a shooter, but he stopped really playing only into his lane. And I think that's what we're seeing with Slavkovsky, where, carrying the puck, going diagonally and all that. This is something that we used to see a lot more on the international level. And with the Canadiens, we're seeing it more and more because he gets more comfortable, so that vision's getting better, and that hockey IQ is able to demonstrate itself.
Yeah, 100%. So that's, I think that, to me, that was the biggest sort of theme coming out of the game on Saturday, was just that how these two young players, first round picks, a couple of years apart, are just are looking like they will be able to carry a certain load for this team when they're competitive, and that's encouraging.
So, okay, let's switch gears to from the near future to the very, very present. We discussed Sean Monahan not too long ago, but he's the topic. Everybody talks about Sean Monahan in town. He's constantly trending on Twitter. There's been a bit of a backlash. People saying, "Oh, you guys are out of your mind thinking that the Canadiens will only get a second rounder for him." It's borderline bad faith from you to say that. He's for sure going to earn them a first round pick. I maintain that it could change. I mean, the Canadiens, if Monahan keeps playing like that without getting hurt and just sustains that level of play, he might enter a window where he would earn the Canadiens a first round pick. But it's far from a given. The fact that he's taking so many therapy days, I'm sure that any team that's interested in his services must be taking notes of the fact that his health is a bit of a risk, and it's going to be teams that are interested in him probably won't be interested only in bringing him as a rental, but will explore the possibility of signing him to a contract for the future. So you want to have Monahan now, you want to have him for the future, but what does he mean for the future? If a team is convinced that they can gamble on him and his health for a 3, 4, 5 year contract, they might be willing to give more than if he's just a rental. But we cannot assume that it's going to be a given at this point. It's
Not
if
at
the
all.
floor if the floor is a second round pick, if the Canadiens get a second round pick, that's a good start. If they can get more, well, good stuff, man. Kudos to them. But I cannot, despite his stellar play, and I recognize that right now he's back to being the Sean Monahan from the beginning of the season, and he's playing super well.
Mm-hmm.
But it's going to, the Canadiens are going to need a bit more sample size, and the other teams will need a bit more reassurance along the lines. And in that sense, the next few weeks are going to be key for the Canadiens to extract maximum value for him. But at the same time, the tricky part is, because of his health, maybe you don't want to wait too long either and expose yourself to the possibility that he might get injured. And then you close your window the way that it happened last year. So I don't know. It's a tricky situation.
Well, here's the thing: is that prior to last year, it was relatively common for rentals to bring back a first round pick, basically on their own. Like it's not like they gave up first round picks for everyone, but Ben Sherratt got a first round pick, Claude Giroux. Tyler Bertuzzi was last year, but Claude Giroux, Andrew Kopp got a first round pick for the Jets. David Savard, famously, like Jason Zucker, Nick Foligno. There were many cases of this happening. Last season, however, you saw a bit of a shift. Like Bo Horvat and Tyler Bertuzzi, as just mentioned, are kind of two of the only guys who really, on their own, merited a first round pick. Otherwise, you saw packages. Like purely in terms of UFA rentals, like Vladislav Gavrikov, Jonas Korpisalo, first round pick went back to Columbus, but it was two of them. Dmitry Orlov and Garnet Hathaway from the Bruins got a first round pick for the Capitals. Vladimir Tarasenko, they had to throw in Mikola, who's kind of a depth defenseman, is now in Florida, for the Rangers to give the Blues a first round pick. So, it's possible, and even in the case of Horvat, knowing Lou Lamoriello, he probably already had a good idea that he'd be able to get Horvat signed, which, and they didn't only give up a first round pick, they gave up a pretty good prospect in Natu Ratu. I don't know how, I don't know what the extent to which, and Anthony Beauvillier was thrown in, but that was more to kind of make the money work.
Yeah.
So it's the one thing the Canadiens have an advantage on with Monahan is that it's not going to be hard to make the money work. Because of the nature of his contract, he should be able to fit into any team's budget, especially the closer we get to the deadline, which speaks to what you're talking about. How much risk do you want to take? But, looking at that, what strikes me is that if the Canadiens if that's a trend more than a one-off, because it could have been just teams looking at the 2023 draft, looking at the quality of it and saying, we're not giving up a first round pick in this draft. Maybe they'll look at 2024 differently and be more willing to give up a first round pick but that extra body, to bring the deal home, in terms of a rental for the Canadiens, they're basically limited to Tanner Pearson. Tanner Pearson at $3.25 million a year, obviously in the final year of his contract, and has not played like a player that any team would really want to add. He does have the benefit of a track record, but his recent track record is just health problems all over the place, even this season. So they don't really have that rental sweetener to get the first round pick that was required last season, at least in more cases than not. So it's interesting. I don't know if they have a lot of other sweeteners, like, I don't know, Jesse Ullinen, maybe
defenseman, yeah,
or depth defenseman.
But
they have a lot of. But as far as rentals go, as far as adding a depth rental, they don't have that guy that they could add, other than unless Tanner Pearson somehow miraculously in the next month could make himself a relevant enough piece where a team says, okay, if you throw in Pearson, we'll give you a first. It's going to look like more like the Ulonen or Kovacevic or maybe even Harris. I don't know. No, Harris has another year left at 1.4. It's going to look like someone more like that would be able to get the Canadiens that piece. That's assuming that the trade market remains that way as it was last year.
But the fact, I think that Tanner Pearson would only make a trade more complicated than it already is.
Yeah.
But regarding the first round market, what's interesting is that with so few teams that are out of contention, especially in the East, you might have teams that say, you know what, we're not ready for a rebuild just yet. We can still try to make a push and keep our hopes high, and we'll be willing to get rid of a first round pick because we're not there just yet, you know. So not only like the contending teams, but also the bubble teams that say we just need one more guy to get us over the hump, whether it's, I don't know, Washington or, you know, a team like that.
Pittsburgh. I don't know if Pittsburgh has a first round pick to trade, but I don't think they do, actually. Let me just check.
I think they do. But but yeah, so
no, they do. They have next year's first round pick. They don't have this year's first round pick.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, maybe that plays in the favor of the Canadiens, the fact that with so many teams that will be in the hunt, it might serve the Canadiens and might serve the idea of a more of a seller's market. So that's a possibility. Again, I'd be more than happy to see the Canadiens fetching a first round pick for Sean Monahan. It's just,
can I just give you the other side of that?
Yeah.
The other side of that point, and Ken Hughes mentioned it at his midseason thing. You know, he mentioned how all of a sudden, Florida wasn't selling anymore. Calgary was. The circumstances you just described also lends itself to teams at the last second deciding, okay, we don't have it this year. We were in it till late February, lose a few games in a row. Playoffs start to look a little dicey, and all of a sudden they shift into seller mode, and that affects the seller's market and changes it. And so in the case of anyone really, but I mean when you all of a sudden new possibilities for buyers emerge, that impacts the market for your player, because obviously any economic student would know, like, a scarcity of a certain asset increases the value of that asset. So if suddenly, I think Calgary's like a team to look at. Like, if Calgary all of a sudden decides not to sell and they decide to go for it, or at least try to make a playoff run, and hopefully maybe that would convince Elias Lindholm to re-sign, or God knows what they actually want to do. But I mean, if they get into a situation, right now the Flames are 1 point ahead of the Canadiens, but they're just in an entirely different situation with all these UFAs. All their players are at the front of the trade board. I was watching Chris Tanev on After Hours on Saturday with Scott Oak. Just completely uncomfortable with the notion that he's this sought after commodity on the trade market. But that's what they're dealing with. And if they can somehow play themselves into the picture and they decide we're not trading Elias Lindholm, then Monahan's value goes up. But if Lindholm's out there, then Monahan's plan B for a lot of teams,
Yeah, and even maybe plan C, depending on how teams consider Adam Henrique. So, But yeah, he's the second or third option. Yeah, that would help the Canadiens tremendously if the Flames were to hold on Lindholm. There's no doubt about it. And there's also teams that are surprisingly high in the standings, like Philadelphia or Nashville. I mean, are they going to say, "Oh, well, we're playing with house money now, but let's see"? Are they going to stick to the plan? And if they've missed the playoffs, they miss the playoffs. Or they're going to say, well, this is an unexpected chance that we must seize. Therefore, we're going to jump on certain occasions to make ourselves better.
Yeah, today. I don't think either of those teams are going to do that. Personally, I mean, based on everything Daniel Briere has said, based on everything Barry Trotz has said. Although Barry Trotz had a very, very, very unusual offseason last year, but but still, based on everything they've said, I don't see them adding just to slip into the playoffs. You know, that's why the Penguins situation. I saw Sidney Crosby quoted the other day, like we just have to get in. You know, they looked at the Panthers as an example of what they could accomplish. You know, like yes, the season hasn't gone well, just like it hadn't for Florida. They just snuck in and they go to the Stanley Cup final. You know, so it's like that notion exists for a lot of teams, but there's sort of the reality of the situation. I mean, I think very much, let's say the Canadiens were in a position like the Flyers or the Predators are. I don't know if they would behave any differently at the trade deadline. You know, I think they have a very lucid kind of idea of where they're at as a team, and they know full well they're not where they want to be. And I think the same thing exists in Philly. I think the same thing exists in Nashville. But the nature, the parity, the parity on steroids this year, I mean, really gives a notion to like 18, 20 teams that if they get in, they've got a shot to do some damage. Maybe not go all the way to win the cup, but win a couple of rounds, do whatever. So that affects the dynamic at deadline time, because again, if teams jump into the market at the last minute and become sellers, or if teams jump into the market at the last minute and become buyers, it affects the supply and demand dynamics at that time and could either positively or adversely affect Sean Monahan's value.
So you're mentioning the fact that his contract is easy to move. That's true. If the Canadiens were willing also to add another piece, you were mentioning Pearson. If you wanted to move Pearson, you might have to eat some of his salary, and that's another component that we're getting into, is that the Canadiens only have one retention slot remaining, because two of them, and that's until July 1st. So they have retained some salary on Jeff Petrie. They have retained some salary on Joel Edmondson. So now they have only one retention slot remaining. They can either use it at the trade deadline or wait to make a move at the draft. And Petrie, it's over 2 years. So this one retention slot would still be applicable next season. So they have to really evaluate at what time that retention slot is best used. Is it at the trade deadline, or are you better off waiting and try to do something at the draft when the market is different, when the types of possibilities are different, because, you know, everybody's interested, everybody's got more, they see their money differently.
They're going to have more of it. They're going to have more of it coming up for the first time in a long time. But yeah, like I think that last year at the deadline, the Canadiens were less willing to retain money on Mike Hoffman because of how many slots they wanted to leave a slot free for the draft. But I think this year is somewhat different in the sense that everyone's getting the cap bump. So that retention slot might be less important at the draft than it was over the last few years. But it's definitely a factor. You know, like, listen, if the Canadiens are going to trade Jake Allen, well, first of all, for sure, if they're going to trade Tanner Pearson, they're going to have to retain money. Like, there's no doubt about it. So that would take up that last slot, would sort of handcuff them at the draft. But I don't think it's as night or, you know, life or death as it was last year. But if they're going to trade Jake Allen, they're probably going to have to retain salary. And I don't think the Canadiens are all that willing to do that. But because if they do that, then not only do they have no more retention slots this year, that means they only have one retention slot next year. Yeah. Because of Petrie. So it's definitely a factor. Like it's which is what Jake Allen is. It's so complicated with him, is that the extra year, some teams could look at it as a good thing. He's a good insurance policy in goal. Is he a goalie that's going to be a difference maker and win you rounds in the playoffs? Probably not, but he can avoid losing rounds in the playoffs. Like he can prevent you from goaltending being the reason why you got knocked out of the playoffs, as opposed to goaltending being the reason why you advance. So that has some value to it, but it's the retention issue is, I think, really going to be uh, sort of a top of mind issue, and the Canadiens' willingness to do that with Allen is going to be interesting to see, because already, Ken Hughes, when he made the Jeff Petrie trade to Detroit and agreed to retain this year and next, he kind of qualified it as being like, well, we got a good young defenseman who was Gustav Lindstrom, who now plays for the Anaheim Ducks, was lost on waivers. Got a good goalie who is Calvin DeHaan and now plays, not Calvin DeHaan, what's Casey DeSmith? Yeah, that's right. Casey DeSmith, who now plays in Vancouver and netted the Canadiens Tanner Pearson, said, we felt, obviously they got a draft pick out of it. And so
that was the main thing. The second round pick was the meaty part. Yeah.
Yes, but it's that's the price that they paid for a second round pick, was to take on 2.4 or whatever it is, $2.3 million on their cap next year. So, the management of that retention slot, I think it would make the Canadiens somewhat uneasy to head towards the draft with no retention slots available. But I do think that this year is somewhat different than last year, in the sense that there's more money in the pool. Therefore, maybe retaining salary will become less of an issue, and they can maybe manage it. So, but I'm of the mind that the only person that they would even consider using that retention slot for would be Allen, even if it really ties their hands next year.
Probably that they have more flexibility and leeway if they're looking at taking a contract back in return, because that space is not unlimited, but almost. I mean, they've got so much money available to them on LTIR that they could certainly take a bad contract back, at least for the end of this season, and
as opposed to retaining salary. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So then you could potentially trade Allen if you take back a bad contract in return. It's probably an avenue that's worth pursuing more. I don't know to which extent you can have both a match for a team that looks for a goalie, B, a team for whom it makes sense to have a goalie signed next year at that price, and C, that has a bad contract to trade in return. So it becomes and D, convincing that team that Allen is the best candidate among all the available goalies out there. So
yes,
it's not an easy thing. But going back to Monahan, or maybe we could. We'll go back to that in the mailbag. We'll start our mailbag with a question on Monahan that was asked to us. But in the event that Monahan gets traded, what do you think will be the effect on the Canadiens in the standings?
Well, I mean, you look at their schedule, right? And if you just start on March 8th, like, right now, the Canadiens are one of those teams. They're not far from those teams that could consider themselves on the cusp of something. They're 3 points behind the Penguins. They're 4 points behind the Islanders. They're 3 points behind the Devils. They're 3 points behind the Capitals. They're 1 point behind Calgary. These are all teams that could be convinced one way or the other that they're still in it. But the Canadiens are not in it. Like, that's the thing. Like, those, when I say they're 3 points behind someone, that's a lot. It's a lot to make up. Like, you can win like 6 or 7 games and make up 2 points in the standings. Like, it's really difficult to move up. But if the Canadiens, and so looking the other way, right now the Canadiens are 1 point up on the Minnesota Wild, Canadiens are 26th overall. So if the draft lottery were happening today, they would have the 7th best odds in the lottery. They're tied in points with Buffalo, but Buffalo has way more regulation wins. It's not even close. It's 20-11. But so they would have the 7th best odds. To me, you look at it, they're 8 points ahead of the Columbus Blue Jackets, who right now would have the 5th best odds. So there's not much. The bottom 5 seems pretty set. Columbus, Ottawa. Even though Ottawa has a bunch of games in hand at this point, like after the deadline, having games in hand is almost a detriment, because it means you're playing more games in a compressed amount of time. Then you have Anaheim, San Jose, and Chicago. Like, I don't think the Canadiens are getting below Columbus.
No.
They could get below Minnesota, who's only a point back, but who also might become sellers. Even though Bill Guerin has steadfastly said he believes in his team's ability to make the playoffs, at some point, reality will hit that man, and he will understand that.
Usually, I thought it would have happened already, but obviously it has not.
But by the deadline, maybe it will, and maybe they also will sell off some parts. So basically, you're looking at the difference between 7th and 6th. Is really, I think, the most, the best that they could hope for in the lottery. Definitely trading away Monahan would help the Canadiens have a better shot in the draft lottery. It would for sure hurt them, although, trading Monahan would be coupled with the return of Alex Newhook, which is worth keeping in mind. So
they're not going to trade Monahan before Newhook comes back, right?
Well, I mean, if Newhook looks like he's on the road, like he should be, the timeline was kind of mid-February. It's looking that way. He's on the ice with equipment. Like it's, so yeah, I don't think, but in the event Newhook weren't back, I don't think that would change their plans with Monahan. I think if the deadline hit and Newhook wasn't back and someone was offering whatever they're going to offer for Monahan, they would trade him. My opinion. Just waiting for Newhook to come back. He'll be back eventually. And so there's no, like, for Team Tank.
That's who we're catering for the 2 years.
Well, that's it. Team Tank, they're not going much further down than they are right now. But Team Tank would like the fact that if they trade Monahan, they're not likely to move up much from what they are right now. So it's, Team Tank's nemesis is always Sam Montembeault, and Sam Montembeault will still be around, and maybe he's going to win his share of games, not by himself, but he will help that cause. And so I think, somewhere in this range, I mean, there's 5 teams here within 2 points of each other. Arizona's 23rd overall at 49 points. Calgary's 24th at 49. Buffalo and Montreal are at 48, and Minnesota's at 47.
Right.
So pretty wide range there of teams and where they would position themselves for the lottery. But for sure, losing a Monahan would quote unquote help the Canadiens finish at the bottom of that pack. But 27th overall or 6th best lottery odds is probably the best they could hope for.
When you look at the points percentages within that pack, the Canadiens, have been hovering around 500 roughly the whole season. I think that the highest they went was 515, if I'm not mistaken, but that was about it. So there are certain teams that are ahead of them, even though the Canadiens are just 3 points behind Washington and New Jersey. Those teams are at 543, which is something that the Canadiens have never reached this season. So if you look at teams after that, Arizona at 510, Calgary 500, Buffalo 490, just like the Canadiens, and Minnesota 480. The Canadiens could easily, with a push, finish ahead of all those teams and end up being 23rd in the standing. So at this point, it's going to be, no matter if they trade Monahan or not, they're likely to finish somewhere between 23 and 27. But the earlier you trade Monahan, the better your chances are to finish lower in that group. So that's
the way things are looking. I mean, the Canadiens could be in line to draft Cole Yzerman. The way he's sort of trending on some draft boards, I'm seeing, like, if you finish in that range and you're picking between 7 and 10, he could drop to you. For all we know, Demidov could drop that far, although I really doubt it. But
never, not a chance.
It's possible. No. He's Russian. Yes, he might never. It's the same factors with Michkov exist with Demidov. They do. He's a Russian kid. It's teams are going to be squeamish. I could definitely see teams passing on him for that reason alone. And so it's a possible. You can't say never. It's possible. We saw it 2 years, a year before Michkov's draft. I would have said he will never fall to 7. It would be impossible for him to fall to 7. And what happened? He fell to 7. So it's a possibility. You can't. The situation in Russia remains what it is. It hasn't changed. So it's. It's a possibility. So I think there could be some interesting players that fall to the Canadiens, especially considering the how defense heavy the draft is this year, and the Canadiens I think clearly would be in the market for a forward. Um, that should help them as well. I think if most teams decide to go after the defensemen who are available, which I think they will, that could help, and that pick could wind up being a very talented pick. We'll see.
6, 7, or 8, the Canadiens might be in a position to draft also Caden Lindstrom from Medicine Hat. I mean, right now he's injured, but I mean, he was before he got injured. He was really he was having an impressive season in the WHL. 6'4", 216, big guy, big. It'd be an interesting guy to add to your lineup.
Yeah, or they could, Berkeley Catton would be there too. I mean, he's a smaller center, and this organization tends to. I mean, based on them not drafting Zach Benson, I think they look at smaller centers with a bit of disdain. But yeah, I do think just the way the draft seems to be playing out this year, picking between 6 and 10, a pretty interesting young forward should be available to them in that spot, depending on how cards play out. All right, let's hit the mailbag for Monday.
Yeah, but I want to start. I want to read the first question because it concerns Monahan. So I just want to wrap up Monahan by asking. Scott Haggett is asking us: would Monahan come back after being a rental? What price and term would be in play if he wants to? Who would be making counter offers?
Okay, well, I don't know who would be making counter offers, but first of all, trading a player away only to have him come back and re-sign as a rental is extremely rare. There's a certain, I think for players, when you decide not to extend him at the deadline, it's sort of like you've become part of my past, and there's not a big willingness to, and that you're actually more inclined to sign with the team that traded for you and showed that they wanted you than you are. And the other thing being that, yes, the Canadiens they're building for the future. Sean Monahan could believe in that future as much as he wants, but it's still going to take time for him at his stage of his career. It'd probably make more sense to try and go win somewhere sooner. The other thing, though, is the contract that Sean Monahan would be in line for. And it's hard for me to look at. I mean, I think the floor for a term that Sean Monahan would be looking for would be 4 years. You're looking at a salary number that at least starts with a 5. Those are the floors. Like if he hits the market, if he goes to a playoff bound team, has an incredible playoffs in sort of a secondary role, but can play special teams, can win faceoffs, can do all these things that help good teams win, he'll hit the market and he'll be sought after. And if I'm Sean Monahan, I look at the contract that Andrew Kopp signed with the Red Wings 2 years ago after being traded at the deadline to the Rangers. He got 5 years at 5.6, if I'm not mistaken.
That's insane money for that guy.
Exactly, but that's the nature of the unrestricted free agent market. And if I'm Sean Monahan, I'm like, 5.625 for 5 years. And if I'm Sean Monahan, I'm looking at Andrew Kopp and being like, I'm better than that guy. Like, no disrespect to Andrew Kopp. I think he's actually a very good player. He's not a 5 years times $5.625 million player. Kopp was 28 when he signed that deal. Monahan is 29, but he'll be 30 in October. So, he's a bit older and he has some durability concerns. But, when Kopp signed that deal, he had 202 points in 483 career games. And he had a career high 53-point season that year. But it was the first time he came close to 50 points. Sean Monahan has 514 points in 730 career games as we speak right now, not counting what he's going to do for the rest of the season. Far more accomplished player. Just a lot more pedigree. I mean, the only thing that's dragging down Monahan's value is this perceived questioning of his durability and whether he's going to make it to the end of the contract to be able to play. And he hasn't missed a game this year. We mentioned earlier all the therapy days, and absolutely, like getting treatment on practice days. I think one thing that's worth noting is that Sean Monahan doesn't strike me as a guy who really likes practice. He's not. He's not. He's not the type of guy who's like first on the ice. He's usually last on the ice and first off. Like
Yeah.
he doesn't strike me, especially for morning skates. I shouldn't say that about practices, but like for morning skates, I've never seen him take part in an optional morning skate. So keep that in mind. But I mean, I do think
he takes the fastest showers since Tomasz Plekanec.
Oh, dude, we're often waiting for the room to open, and Sean Monahan goes walking by with his bag of food, and he's gone. Like before we've even entered the room. So, but yeah, that Cop contract again. Detroit giving JT Compher a 5-year deal at $5.1 million a year. Like if I'm Sean Monahan, I look at those two contracts in back-to-back years. Granted, from one team specifically, but I'm saying I'm worth at least as much as that. And for the Canadiens, does that make a whole lot of sense? I'm not sure it does.
No, you're right about that. I mean, it's always regarding the contract. If you wanted to make like a short term, if you wanted to bring back Monahan short term, it would make sense. Mm-hmm. I understand how it would be appealing to the Canadiens, but to commit to the sort of money and term that he's going to look for, I just don't see it, because you end up, not only are you exposing yourself to the risk of repeating the same mistake that was made with Brendan Gallagher, but there's also the fact that if the sentiment of your future for now, at least with the guys that you have at your disposal, are Suzuki and Doc, well, then he's either your third line center or he's playing wing on your top six. So are you going to commit for him to play as a winger for that many years? I don't know. And I know the fans might not like him a whole lot, but Christian Dvorak is still under contract. So if you want to bring back Monahan and be your third line center, then it means also trying to move Dvorak, which is a whole challenge in itself. So I don't think that the Canadiens are the best fit for that. And going back to Scott's initial question, would it be possible to bring him back after he was a rental? I mentioned Plekanec. Plekanec was one of the only ones who ever did that. He was traded to Toronto and was brought back to Montreal, but he had the CH tattooed on his heart. Uh-huh. And before that, I think we go back to Doug Weight, who had been traded by St. Louis. I think it was to Carolina, and then he came back to St. Louis after. But it's a very, very rare thing to happen.
It almost never does.
No.
Okay, let's move on to the next question in our mailbag. Mailbag. Maybe some people consider it a bog, but this one comes from Christian Morin, who asks, a recurring question in the last 2 to 3 seasons has been who can play on Suzuki and Caulfield's wing. While Marty St. Louis continues to be seduced by the combination of Slaf, Monahan, Armia, this question has once again become top of mind, and a renewed source of fan frustration towards Josh Anderson, who continues to be placed on the top line despite ample evidence that it just does not work. Why isn't HP's hat in the ring? Last season, he scored at a great, albeit unsustainable pace while playing with Suzuki. He can make his line mates' lives a lot easier by doing the dirty work, all by being one of the Canadiens' best defensive forwards. I would take that over the current Marty can exponentially develop Anderson's hockey IQ at the age of 29 experiment. I'm not suggesting HP is the answer on a permanent basis, but until the return of Doc and Newhook, why not? What say you to that?
I think it's a fair question. That's what I would do. But the problem is right now is because of the lack of depth on this team and the fact that they have offensively only two lines going. Uh-huh. You can manage to make HP useful on your bottom six while trying to make Josh Anderson effective or useful in your top six, albeit the proof has been demonstrated ample times that it didn't work with Caulfield and Suzuki. So I would be more than in favor of seeing Alvi Pinard taking that spot. But my point is, Alvi Pinard, if he plays on the third line or fourth line, he can help you. I'm not sure that you put maybe Anderson with Evans could work. You could do Pearson, Evans, Anderson. I guess.
Sure.
I guess so. I mean, it's the only alternative. But to me, it'd be a lot easier to move Anderson around if you had another centerman that was there, and you could sort of build a third line that was slightly more productive and offensive minded. Mm-hmm. But I mean, Pearson, if you were mentioning the fact, well, we could cross our fingers and hope that he rediscovers his offensive groove. Pearson, Evans, Anderson. Yeah, I could see that. Could see that happen. Harvey Pinard, I mean, he likes to go in the dirty areas. He'll fight for any puck, and I think that he's got a lot to bring to this line. Mm-hmm. Anderson, we went on like in length the last episode. It's just not working.
Yeah, I mean, there's no need to repeat what I said in the last episode, where I would literally take any other winger on that line other than Josh Anderson. He's the one guy I don't think should ever play with Cole Caulfield and Nick Suzuki ever again. Mm. That's all I have to say about that. Thank you for the question, Christian.
Yeah, I got one here from Crash Kramer, also goes by the Twitter handle Caulfield Season. Logan Mailloux for Zachary Bolduc, who says no? I would say Montreal. Logan Mailloux, Zachary Bolduc, so first round pick of the St. Louis Blues. I believe it was back in 2021. So he was drafted as a centerman out of the Quebec Ramparts, and but he's been moved to the wing earlier this year in his first season in the American League. Crafty player, great wrister, but the book on him was that for all the offensive tools that he's got, he remains a perimeter player and a guy that doesn't always play with top intensity. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that profile is really what interests the Montreal Canadiens right now. So if you trade a big-bodied, puck-moving, right-handed defenseman, who, if it was not for the history surrounding his draft and surrounding his behavior, might very well have been drafted ahead of Bolduc in the first place, just based on raw talent alone. I don't think that the Canadiens would. I don't. Let's put it this way. I don't think the Canadiens would necessarily be against the idea of trading Logan Mailloux if it was for a piece that would make them significantly better and make him part of a package that would bring back an impact player. But they would not trade him for a centerman turned wing, whose level of or whose competitiveness is a bit of a question mark. So to me, it's just it's at best a sideways move. So you were talking earlier about Guhly, about scarcity of position. That's what you get also with Logan Mailloux. So it's tread carefully. If you want to move him, make sure that you're going to move him for somebody who's going to be impactful. So that's why, even though Zachary Bolduc's a homegrown product, that doesn't mean that the Canadiens are always going to fall and pay the premium to get a player of that sort.
No, as a matter of fact, it's not that they're less willing. I don't want to say it that way, but they're not willing to pay the premium that teams expect them to pay when they have a Quebec player. Like that's
what I meant. That's
it. Like, so every team in the league assumes like, oh, the Canadiens are desperate for homegrown talent. They have so much pressure on them to add it. Let's extract more value out of these guys than we normally would be able to with a player like Zachary Bolduc or any player that, we heard a lot about Xavier Bourgault on the Oilers. Like it's teams just naturally assume that the Canadiens are going to come on their hands and knees hoping to land that Quebec kid. And I can tell you for a fact that this front office is not going to do that. They're just not. It's not that they're not willing to go get Quebec-born players, but they're not willing to pay the premium that teams expect. And Zachary Bolduc as a rookie in the AHL this year has 6 goals and 14 assists in 42 games. So I would agree that Logan Mailloux could very well be a trade commodity for the Canadiens at some point. It's not going to be for a player like this. There's That's how I feel about it. Okay, let's get. And there was a mailbag question. I can't find it right now, but there was a mailbag question asking why is the premium placed on right shot D as opposed to left shot D? The simple reason being that there are fewer of them. You know, they're far more left shot D than there are right shot D. So when you can find one that's effective, that has a premium placed on it just because of scarcity of position. So Martin Bélanger, or no, sorry, Sam M had a question. Are the Habs trying to pick up players from contenders to use more of their potential LTIR space? Between Dvorak and Doc's contract, there's $7.8 million, which could be placed on LTIR, and it's worth pointing out those contracts have not been placed on LTIR as we speak today. Say a capped-out team wanted to upgrade their roster, but there wasn't a fit. Would the Habs take on an underperforming player to allow that to happen for them? The player could be flipped, or he could just be stuck on the Habs roster for the rest of the year. Well, Sam, it's a very good point, and I think it could wind up being a possibility. I know that the Canadiens in past years have wanted to get into the cap broker market. Last season, what trade was it? I think the Ryan O'Reilly deal went through Minnesota. Am I right about that?
Yeah. They extracted a 4th round pick for that.
And the Orlov Hathaway deal to Boston also went through Minnesota, and Montreal was in on both of those. So ultimately, it didn't happen, and I think there was some belief that the inclusion of the Bruins and the Leafs in both of those deals made it more complicated for Montreal and made them less willing to give the Canadiens anything. But it's definitely something that they have pursued over the last couple of years. I have no doubt they would pursue it again, especially with all this extra money that's available to them. If they can get assets to be a cap broker, I'm sure they will. So we'll see. But it's a good point by you, Sam, and it's definitely a possibility coming up prior to the deadline.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about bad contracts, Canadiens getting bad contracts back. The problem also with all that LTIR money that they have available is sure the Canadiens could say, well, we're going to take this bad contract off your hands so that you can improve yourselves in the short term. But there's very few of those players that could actually be on the market and make sense for Montreal, because the free agents that have a high price, a high ticket, are either teams that are still in the hunt and for whom those players are useful. I'm thinking of Stamkos. I'm thinking of Tyler Myers in Vancouver. I never thought I'd say that, but that's true. And also the teams that are completely out of contention, they're not necessarily going to try to get rid of bad money in the short term. That's not to mention the guys that are already on LTIR, the Brent Seabrooks of the world and the Matt Murrays. So ultimately, players that are like underperforming, high priced, and could be flipped, in a situation like this. I'm thinking maybe of Anthony Manta in Washington, even though he's got 15 goals in 43 games, which is not too bad.
But they've been trying to trade him. They've been trying to trade him forever.
Yeah, well, I mean, if it's just as a cap dump, I could see the Canadiens trying to acquire him, and he finishes the season in Montreal, and if on trade deadline day he interests somebody, well, good. But otherwise, you just make him finish his $5.7 million contract this season in Montreal. But apart from that, there's very few guys. Jason Zucker, I mean, Arizona will try to move him. They will. Jacob Vrana, maybe in St. Louis. That could be one. Jacob Vrana, 5.25. But there's very few candidates. So it's as attractive or as interesting a position the Canadiens are into acquiring that sort of asset. It's just the candidates are very, very few. One last one. Yeah, I think you had one from Martin Bélanger, right?
Yeah, this is a quick one. Martin asked, how far in the future are teams allowed to trade draft picks? For example, let's say the Devils trade for Allen. Instead of getting a draft pick for this upcoming draft, would the Canadiens be able to request a 2028 second-round pick for him? Short answer is yes, they could. Longer answer is that teams the reason why you rarely see, the NBA, this happens all the time where you have like very long-term, very future draft picks traded. You don't see it in the NHL just because of the parity that exists. And I think most teams feel uncomfortable trading picks from a year where they have no idea what their team's going to look like. So there's no rule against it. It's just kind of an internal trend where teams are less willing to gamble on the quality of their team and where they are in the, contending to rebuild spectrum so far down the line when, competitive windows can be long, like the Lightning have had, or they can be extremely short, like the Canadiens had. Like went from the Stanley Cup final to a lottery team within one off season. So somewhere in between, you never know how long your window is going to last. And so I think a lot of teams are very reticent, but I don't think there's any rule against it.
Apart from trades that involve like conditions that could make that pick go from one year to the next, and it sort of trickles down.
Like the Monahan trade.
Like the Monahan trade.
Yeah.
Like just a pure trade, like for a pick down the future. On top of my head, the one example that comes to my mind is Keith Kincaid, who was drafted in February of 2019 from the New Jersey Devils to the Columbus Blue Jackets for a 5th round pick in 2022. So that was
3 years down the line. 3 years down the line. Yeah.
So
but
it's
exceedingly rare.
It's four drafts down the line because you include the 2019 draft, the 2021, so 4th draft down the line. So that's the furthest that I can remember. Yeah. So
when you think of it, like look at some of the ridiculous conditions teams have put on their 1st round pick in recent years. Like you talk about not knowing what your team's going to be like in 2028. The Lightning put top 10 protection on their 2025 1st round pick that they traded for Tanner Jeannot last year. The Leafs put top 10 protection on their 2025 first that they sent to Chicago for Jake McCabe and Sam Lafferty. The Sens put top 5 protection, which was smart, but the Sens put top 5 protection on their 2023 first. They sent for Jacob Chikrin. But yeah, like teams like the Leafs and the Lightning, looking just 2 years down the road, felt skittish enough to put top 10 protection on a 1st round pick. So think of them, 2028 is like a whole other universe to these people. Like it's just not happening.
Yeah, but it's weird because come to think of it, I mean, a team like the Tampa Bay Lightning, the later we go in time, the more likely they are to fall off their cliff and be a bad team. So you put
we're talking about next year's draft here. Like, I don't know if yes, they could be, I guess they could get a top 10 pick, but it's just an indication of how leery GMs are about forecasting their team more than 1 or 2 years down the road,
Yeah, but my point is that the protection is for 2026, 2027. The later you go, the more likely they are to pick top 10. So I guess they made a protection, and I hope for their sake that pick is not part of the top 10, because if it was, then they would move for the next year, and the next year they would be even more likely to get a top 10 pick again, because it means that their window would have closed. But interesting. So no, there's no limit for in terms of time, but it just doesn't happen very often. Not that far away in the future. All right, so that wraps it up for today. Thanks everybody for listening and or watching. We're going to be back on Friday with our Future Friday and all sorts of other topics to discuss. Arpin, you're released from your duties. You can go now.
Okay. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll talk to you on Friday.